Welcome everyone to AsiaLink's webinar, Indonesia's Next President. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are all dialing in from today. For me, that is the Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and community. I pay respects to elders past and present, and to all First Nations people whose land we will discuss today in this webinar. This evening's webinar will be recorded and available to view on AsiaLink's YouTube channel. If you have any questions for any of the panelists, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens, and we will endeavor to answer as many of the questions as possible at the end of the session. I would like to introduce today's moderator, Don Greenlees. He is a Walkley Award-winning journalist, author, and advisor on international political and business affairs. He has spent more than 20 years working in East and Southeast Asia. Don is currently a senior advisor to AsiaLink. I'll now hand over to you, Don.
Thank you very much, Leah, and thank you very much for our three guests joining us today, and what I believe is a fairly large online audience, one of the biggest audiences we've had for one of these webinars. To start with, by way of introduction, the official results of the Indonesian elections came in yesterday. So we thought this would make a good time to review political developments. However, the big result that Prabowo Subianto would be the next president has been known since election day on 14 February. We have seen that result resoundingly confirmed in the official tabulation from the General Elections Commission yesterday. So come October, Prabowo will be sworn in as president. But we've also received the results of elections for the House of Representatives and the quasi-upper house, the Regional Representative Council. So we know the standing of the political parties and the task that Prabowo has in front of him regarding coalition building and his agenda through the legislature. We aim to do three things today. First, review the election outcome. Second, assess what we can expect from a Prabowo presidency. And third, look at what it might mean for Indonesia's international relations, including the bilateral relationship with Australia. All our experts today are very well placed to cover those three angles. And of course, as we usually do, we'll reserve some time for questions towards the end. And I'd encourage all of the participants, all of the audience to start putting questions into the chat box or the Q&A box so we can monitor those. I don't think for this audience, we need to spend too much time on the background. I think you're all pretty familiar with it. So I'll dive straight into the questions, and I think we're keenest to hear from our speakers. So to start with, I'd like to pose a question to all three of you, and we can go around. Indonesia, it seems to have pulled off yet another peaceful election. It set up another peaceful transition of government. Despite that, there seem to be lingering doubts about the quality of the process, just how far and how free, rather, and how fair the conduct of the elections was. So from the perspective of consolidating democracy, the question is, was this election a success or a failure? Now, we can break down that into various components in a minute, but I just want to go around the three of you and get an overall impression from the start. And perhaps we can go to you, Vetti, to kick things off.
Okay. First of all, let me explain to the audience why I'm doing my Elvis Presley impersonation. I broke my glasses, and this is prescription sunnies. I can't see without them. So sorry for my appearance there.
Looking pretty cool, Vetti.
Yeah, right. Well, cooler than usual, you mean, right? I think what the elections actually demonstrated was not the consolidation of democracy, but the consolidation really of the power of oligarchy. And I think this is a result which shows that the oligarchy can and has and will continue to survive and to thrive within democratic processes. So there is no necessary opposition really between democracy and oligarchy. Oligarchy can very much make use of the institutions of democracy as shown in the results of this election.
Okay, so Poppy, briefly, can I turn to you and get your overall assessment?
Yeah, I think, thank you, Pak Don and Pak Fedi and also Kevin. I would like to start by quoting my dear colleague. I think he was invited by Pak Fedi a couple of weeks ago in Melbourne.
Oh.
Yes, I was following also the discussion. I think I'm going to use his sort of like statement responding to this kind of election. It not too surprising, but still shocking. I agree with him. That's what happened now. I think since the beginning when the election, the temporary result has come out, then we knew already that was going to be the final result as we seen from yesterday's announcement from KPU. It means that the Prabowo's landslide victory could be predicted. It wasn't surprising, as we can see. However, what would be the notes from the election here is Jokowi's partiality regarding the process. So I agree with Pak Fedi saying that the result is somehow, for me, it's supposedly a real test for the Indonesia's democracy. Thank you, Pak Don.
And Kevin?
Yeah, I think the way I feel about these elections is they were probably the saddest elections I've seen since 1997, and for slightly similar reasons. I think Ibu Poppy just made reference to the machinations and intrigues and so forth. And the reason I think it was sad, and like 97, was completely unnecessary. I mean, in my analysis from way back was there was no way that Pak Prabowo could lose this year. I mean, he'd positioned himself in the center of the electorate, and the critical element to winning an Indonesian presidential election is not like America, where you simply mobilize the rabble on your side of politics. That's simply not enough to get 50% of the vote. Like Australia, you have to actually appeal to a majority. And so having moved from the right, where he'd played his campaigns in earlier elections, he'd moved to the center, this time having positioned himself and aligned with the government. So in many respects, he was unbeatable. He was unbeatable. Whether it was 1 or 2 rounds was frankly neither here nor there, but he was definitely going to win. And so all of these other kind of, I wouldn't even say illegal. I don't think there's anything illegal, but the trouble was you saw a breakdown of norms and standards. And so I think, as Vedi was saying, the oligarchy can play within the democratic system, but when you start to knock down, I think the Americans use the term guardrails, but it's sort of the norms and standards of behavior, of sort of democratic behavior. That's a different thing. And I think it's legit for the president to have a view on who the next president is. It's completely normal. I think that's silly to say that the president has to sit there on their hands. But what they do is much more important to consider. And I think I think we've seen some breakdown of standards over the last few years, and that was just continued through this campaign.
Now, it'd be good to come to the actual practice of those things that you've identified that break down traditions of electoral management, and I'll come back to that in a moment because I think it's an important issue. But just sticking with the sort of helicopter view at the moment, bearing in mind we've got a predominantly Australian audience. What do you think is the long-term trajectory for Indonesian democracy? We've witnessed a gradual erosion over a long period of time. It seems to be the loss of one right or one freedom at a time, hastening arguably under the Jokowi administration. do you see a substantial risk of Indonesia sliding back to a kind of democratic autocracy? And let's do this in reverse order. You go, Kevin, and we'll come back round.
I don't think there's such a thing as a democratic autocracy. You're either a democracy or not.
And
so I think what's been going on here
for some countries, but
it's been happening more over the last
buzzwords.
Okay, let's enjoy the buzzwords. I think this is the first era, the first Jokowi period, I think was pretty much stayed the course. It's the second period where we've seen some of these slippages on standards and so forth. And certainly, you know, on the corruption thing, that to me is a very interesting case. The country peaked in 2019 on the global standings, where it actually entered the top half of the world. Well, we've now gone back 10 years. And so there's not it's not to say there isn't a relationship between all of these issues, because I believe there are. And so additional to that, of course, is that it's a global trend. So in some respects, is Indonesia falling faster than other countries around the region, or is it holding up with a little bit more resilience than other places? So perhaps recently in Australia, we've seen the visit of the president of the Philippines, where there does appear to have been a wonderful and very nice reversal of where that country had been going under its former president. And personally, I hope our incoming president in Indonesia looks to that as a kind of way forward in terms of the dignity of the country, of the family, and everything else. But, you know, so I think the bottom line here is Indonesia slipping backwards faster than elsewhere? I don't think so, but it is slipping. And so it behooves all who are interested in a better republic to see, okay, what possibly can be done. And collectively, maybe with other democracies. I think democracies have to stick together or they're all going to collapse separately.
And Poppy, can I get you to pick up on that? If anybody doesn't have a particularly strong view, feel free to pass. But what are your thoughts, Poppy?
Yeah, I think first I agree with Kevin regarding this is also what we can see is also the global trend, the decline of democracy all over the world. That was one thing. But in case of Indonesia, I can see from at least two aspects. The first one is, in my opinion, what we see here is the failure of the political education among the young generation. There was what I see as a disconnection between the narrative in the elites, the academics, with the one that have been probably going on in the narrative in the more grassroots area. So that's what we see. Some people say that probably the things that Jokowi has done, especially in supporting Prabowo, with the result is the Prabowo's landslide victory, promoting his own son. For some people, there were sort of like the notes from what the result of the elections. But it seems that that kind of narrative is disconnected with the most of the grassroots see what's going on. Some people still see that Jokowi is also contributing for the technocratic development and things like that. So that's why I think, in my opinion, one of the things that we can see in the long term is what we can see and what we can do regarding the political education among the wider audience, I suppose, Don.
And Vidi, I'll come to you with the same question, but I might vary it a little bit in the context that time seems to have been Prabowo's greatest ally. Memories are fading. If you look at the disposition of the electorate, the demography, many more young voters, a very small proportion have any familiarity with the Suharto era. Don't, you know, see Prabowo in the same light that our generation did, who were there on the ground witnessing those sorts of things. Do you think, in terms of that question and tying it in with the decline of democracy, do you think it's simply a case of memories fading?
Well, there is an element of that, clearly, in that a significant portion of the electorate did not experience the new order and witness Prabowo's role in it. However, I would like to point out that Prabowo is far from the very first new order figure to have reconfigured himself or remade himself into a Democrat. A bunch of them have done that over 25 years. People who were very, very much, at the center of New Order authoritarianism, by the year 2000, 2001, had been promoting themselves as great Democrats. And that has continued. So from that point of view, Prabowo was a bit late, actually, although he's done it in a particularly dramatic fashion. But going back to your original question, I think what we're going to see is really the acceleration of the erosion of democracy, because this particular democratic event has, as I mentioned earlier, enabled more than ever before the consolidation of oligarchic forces over the institutions of Indonesian democracy. And therefore, its ability to push back the reforms and the achievements of the previous 25 years would be more open to it. And last thing I'd like to say, and I'd like to Poppy and Kevin's view on this. I think that this election shows one thing that is very important about Indonesian politics in its democracy, which very few people, I think, have commented on up to now. And that is that actually it has shown that it is the bureaucracy, the apparatus of the bureaucracy that counts. It is the weight of the bureaucracy behind Prabowo and his alliance that I think has made a big difference. I think it shows that the political parties actually, have a rather limited role in Indonesian democracy in their ability to drive the way Indonesian democracy actually takes place, partly because the issues of the grassroots issues that Poppy was talking about, and moreover, that not only are political parties not particularly effective in relation to the bureaucracy, especially when the bureaucracy is married to big capital, as it is in this particular case. All the big, sort of capitalists were behind this particular alliance, but also civil society is no match, right? So civil society, really, really marginal players. Political parties are there as sort of the facade, like the actors on the screen, but the directors, the screenwriters, the producers, they're in the bureaucracy.
Can I turn that over to you, Kevin? Because I think we discussed this the other day, this sort of the power of the bureaucracy and influencing electoral outcomes. How profound do you think that is?
I'm probably a little more agnostic on that perspective. I'd take into mind a couple of examples. For a long time, for example, the Ministry of Home Affairs has wanted to get rid of direct election for governors. They tried it once in 2014. We had a president at the time who was at least sensitive to public concerns and pretty much upended that soon after. And the same politicians who kind of fell over themselves to agree to this change fell over themselves the other way to go back to what the public were demanding, considering popularity for direct elections is around about 80%. So there was an occasion. Similarly now for the current draft on the new law on Jakarta, which is currently before the Parliament, something similar was attempted, and that too faced considerable frustration or sort of opposition, and that element's been dropped. But oftentimes a lot of the time you lose. But I'm looking at for example, a number of laws that have been put through over the last 5 years, particularly beginning with a lame duck period like now. So the law on the Anti-Corruption Commission was changed in this lame duck period. So many members of parliament, dead people walking. I mean, they were not running for parliament or they'd been defeated, yet here they are for 6 months passing laws. And so we've just entered that phase now before we inaugurate the new president. This is a period of time when surprising things can get put through the legislative process that quite clearly they wouldn't have dreamed to do before the election. So I think there is a little bit more into play, but I agree very much that the role of civil society in actually being able to effectively advocate and pressure has certainly been diminished, particularly over the last 5 years.
So one of the issues that we see frequently mentioned when it comes to the quality of the elections is the misuse of state resources. And, you know, in some areas, social assistance fund money, Bansos money, you know, is seen as being a particularly important factor. But then when you look at the way elections are conducted in countries like Australia and the US, government handouts prior to elections are very common.
Yep.
Roads and sports facilities get built in key electorates just before an election. I mean, in many respects, isn't this sort of old-fashioned, hard, pragmatic politics? I mean, how deeply undemocratic is it for a government of the day to be utilising the resources of the state to get their party across the line? We see it all the time here in Australia.
Yeah. I mean, it raises the question, and I've long, actually, I've long looked at a problem here, is that there's excessive criminalization of the political process. I mean, the first democratic elections back in 99, there was something like 4 criminal articles in the election law. We've now got 62 or something. I mean, nobody can be a candidate and not end up breaking some or other silly regulation, including, and so the problem is you really should be focusing on things that are really evil. And so some candidate throwing envelopes of money around the public, but if you're going to blow your money like that, that's your business. And it's a civil society job to actually explain to the voters, do you really want to elect a bankrupt that's in debt to whomever and expect that they're going to be an effective representation? You can't do that when it's actually illegal. And actually, I kind of compliment incoming President Prabowo for actually saying that. You know, if someone's stupid enough to give you money, take it. So in some respects, the transformation from doshing out envelopes, the more sophisticated ways they slip it into Bibles, Qurans, jilbabs, rosaries, and kind of use sacred symbols as a desperate attempt to try to seal the deal. Again, even that's, I don't think, particularly evil. But if you have to try to prove that you did it, or somebody wants to manipulate the count, then I think you're onto subversion, and that should be seriously criminal. But this other noise, I think, is a distraction. And similarly, I also get the point about traditional pork barreling. And so maybe that's where the process is going to head into the future. We'll get more of that. I mean, our candidates in Australia, as you know, every time they run, it's, I promise I'll build you a new school or a new hospital or a new road or a new park or a new something else. Actually, they're not even delivering. They're just promising. The Bansos stuff's at least been delivered, I guess, as it gets out.
Look, the bottom line, there's not much difference.
If I may intervene here, I'd like to actually get Poppy's view on this, because she's actually, I know that she's in a position where there's pressure from below and also pressure from above in relation to the elections and coming from the bureaucracy, especially from above. But Don, I think you're drawing a false equivalence. When you are able to harness the entire weight of the bureaucratic apparatus from the central to the local level in the interest of the candidates that you are supporting, it is a bit different, right? Not just in terms of quantity, but in terms of type and quality of intervention. We're talking about actually harnessing the power of the state in order to ensure an electoral result that is acceptable to those who happen to be, in a position to undertake that sort of maneuvering over the state. I mean, even Trump was not able to do that as much as he tried vis-a-vis the United States bureaucracy. It's impossible. And you can't do that with the Australian bureaucracy either, as much as you would try.
Well, there are many inventive ways of
and that
doing
is
it.
why
Right.
actually a lot of anti-democrats, I think in America or in Australia and so on, are always so envious of Asian autocrats. Oh, they can do whatever they want. We'd like to do that, actually.
Mm. Well, look, there are many inventive ways of doing it in Australia, and running public service campaigns that suit the incumbent party.
We're not talking about the same scale, I'm afraid, Don.
No, look, I accept that, Betty. I mean, it's not on the same scale, and nor is the amount of money spent. I mean, I guess my next question is, what do you do to get big money out of Indonesian politics? And it's a hoary old problem that comes around. My understanding is PDIP had a budget of about 7 trillion rupiah for this campaign, which in Australian dollars, I think is about 675 million Australian dollars, and Prabowo spent more. The way donors see themselves, they regard themselves more as investors than donors, and ultimately that's a significant source of corruption in politics. So how realistic is it to consider very serious political finance reform? Or are the parties too deeply engaged in that for it to be even a consideration?
I think there are a couple of points that should be made there. Firstly, there's been a overwhelming privatization of the political process since the beginning of the reform era. So in the pre-democratic era, the parties were actually quite generously funded. They all got offices down to the Kabupaten level. They got annual stipends for managing administration. They got equal airtime. So the only time media coverage was genuinely fairly fair was actually during the campaign period. But of course, we all know the elections were we knew who was going to win 5 years before, of course, because the whole broader setting had been put into place. But actually during the campaign period, they got quite generous funding for various things. Most of that came to a complete halt after 99. So basically all of the parties, all the candidates had to kind of sell themselves off to conglomerates for money because there was no other source. So I think there has been a beginning of a debate about the need for re-putting in public funding. When that first began, civil society said, oh, that's just legalized corruption. But I think civil society has finally moved forward to see that, in fact, it's overly dangerous to be completely reliant on the private sector for all your funding. And the second point I think that needs to be made is the old debate about, do you put campaign finance limits on? And I say that's actually stupid because they'll just get around it. And so what you end up with is double bookkeeping, which means that everyone's liable for serious consequences should the books ever be opened. So that actually tends to ensure that party or party leadership doesn't want to change itself, lest it leave itself open for sort of subsequent problems. I'd much rather know who was giving the money rather than seeing it all hidden in 50 different little bank accounts and whatever. So it's really the transparency side together with actually opening up a lot more public funding to at least put a balance. And as you mentioned, Don, people refer to investments in campaigns. I mean, when I was a kid dealing in politics in Australia, wouldn't have thought about it. Was never thought of as an investment. It was a contribution. It was, dana kejuangan, I guess you'd say in Indonesian. There was no sense that this was an investment, let alone something that was literally transactional, going to come back to me with a profit. So that whole mindset, I think, has completely corrupted the democratic process. And I agree that it's a major challenge that people will really do have to start to work up ways of looking at it. And the issue did come up in the campaign, thank goodness, but, tough thing to push back.
So there are mechanisms to actually note the donations that are given, the contributions, but there are no real mechanisms to actually track the expenditures. And the expenditures are always many-fold, many times more than what's written down as being received by campaigns.
Yes.
Where does the money come from? That's always been the problem with the Indonesian election since Reformasi.
Well, at least everyone gets a new T-shirt. So, Poppy, we haven't heard from you for a couple of minutes. Is this something that you want to weigh into, or should we move on?
Well, I just one point, Pak Don. I think when Pak Fedi mentioned about the mobilization of the state apparatus is something that I found from the current election is also worrying. It's only matched with the new order era. You know, after the reformasi this is the time that we can see the equivalent with what we have done or what we have seen during the new order. One of the thing I think everyone is kind of concerned regarding the how then Jokowi successfully like engineering the constitutional court, for example. This is not only about Prabowo, in my opinion, Pak Fedi, and then how then the state apparatus is mobilized. It's not Prabowo, it's Jokowi. So that's why it is, you know, as we can see, and I know that some of my good friends back then, you know, they were like, you know, against Suharto, but now they're behind Prabowo. But then I think it's not only because of Prabowo, but it's also because Jokowi, and how then some people in the current elite is trying to making sure that all the project, all the infrastructure project, everything that Jokowi has done is going to be continued. So that the only thing that those people probably believe that if then someone who is replacing Jokowi is actually Jokowi's man. So that's I don't think it's only about Prabowo. I know it's worrying, but it's also about the role of Jokowi behind all this.
Now, look, we've spent a bit of time on some of the preliminaries, but we should tackle the election results, the election outcome, which came out yesterday. And no matter what we think of the irregularities in the democratic process, you can't deny the huge victory that Prabowo has had. According to the General Election Commission, he won all but 2 of the 38 provinces, Aceh and West Sumatra. He seems to be the resounding choice of the people. If we put that in the context of Jokowi in 2019 and 2014, Prabowo with, I think, a bit above 58%, 58.6%, was bigger than Jokowi's 56% in 2019 and 53% in 2014. And, you know, with population change, perhaps a relatively high voter turnout, which indicates there is some confidence in the electoral process. It looks like Prabowo will have won an astonishing 96 million votes, which is about 10 more million votes than Jokowi received in 2019 in his great landslides. Now, obviously, demographics have had an impact on that. But there is no question, is there, despite all of these complaints about the way the election was run, that Prabowo is the clear and undisputed choice of the Indonesian people. And isn't that what democracy is about?
The question is directed to whom?
Well, I'll throw that out to whoever's willing to pick it up. So, but yeah, all of you could please respond.
Yeah, I think that clearly Prabowo has always been popular. I mean, he did win 45% of the vote last time around, so it just takes another 5% to get him over the line, right? So from that point of view, you know, the surprising but still shocking thing that Poppy was talking about is absolutely true. Yeah. I think there is no denying that he's always had his basis of support. And I think what this shows really is, you know, the combination of Prabowo and Jokowi is what's unbeatable. I mean, you know, I think that actually pushed him over the line for sure. I mean, I think before, and Kevin, you may correct me on this because I've probably forgotten, but if I'm not mistaken, before Jokowi sort of signaled, you know, in his very, very Japanese way that he was supporting Prabowo. Prabowo was at about 33%, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And he gradually moved up, you know, and as Gibran was picked and so on. And so I think that it has made a big difference. Ganjar was at about 36%, I believe, at one time, when people believed that Jokowi was behind it, right? And now he's plummeted to whatever small percentage that he's got.
Yep.
So clearly, you know, there is a Jokowi factor, right? And Jokowi's ability to his popularity, but also his ability to actually get the state working for him and whatever his agenda is, actually that pushed over Prabowo over the line, notwithstanding that he was always popular and always somebody that had a good chance anyway. But clearly these interventions, including the Mahkamah Konstitusi stuff, these had a role. How much of a role they had, of course, it's impossible to tell, but to say that they didn't have a role, I think is also kind of silly.
I think there's a couple of points, just on setting aside all of the talk about, state apparatus, which, moves a few percent perhaps, but to look at the campaigns by the others. I think, firstly, Prabowo was baked into the system. I mean, he's such a well-known figure. It didn't matter what you would throw at him. People would either say, yeah, I know, but I'm still voting for him. Or, yeah, but that's why I'm not voting for him. So there wasn't much downside for his candidacy. In some respects, Anies was fairly baked onto the system as well. But what happened was, of course, Ganjar kind of went into the stratosphere very, very early because he was seen as, the new Jokowi. But it turned out that's not where he landed politically. And so that's in many respects where I think the president realized his better future was much more to be aligned with Prabowo. So the combination of the two looked very good. And Central Java in particular was very interesting. And it's something that I was always thinking. So in 2019, Jokowi won 77% or so of Central Java. Prabowo, a very well-known national figure, got 23%. The governorship before then, you had a popular governor called Ganjar rerunning for victory, unopposed until quite late in the piece. And then some of the other parties said, come on, you can't have a non-contested election for a big province. So they led on Sudirman Said, who happens to come from Central Java, but not really a politician in that regard, cobbled together a coalition, managed to get through, pulled up 42% of the vote by the time of the vote. So Ganjar only got 58%, Jokowi 77%, running against a national figure, 58% against a newbie. So it always struck me as this is a potential vulnerability. So when the big change occurred, and it was clear that Jokowi Prabowo was a partnership, that left Ganjar very vulnerable in his core province. And so the deflation of his support base was really starting to set in place there. The other side, of course, was Anies's very strange failure to build further to the left of the political spectrum. I mean, the further we went into the campaign, the more he was kind of consolidating his 2-1-2, sort of the Jakarta kind of coalition that was very successful for him when he ran for governor. But he kind of didn't take the opportunity, as I saw it, to expand his base of support. So all of the lost votes from Ganjar really had nowhere to go other than towards Prabowo. So it kind of consolidated in some respects from both ends. So the scale of his victory kind of makes a bit of sense just in terms of the way the other two campaigns rolled out.
No, clearly Java was the key. I mean, Prabowo swept Java, and I think the closest he came was to get a plurality in Jakarta, where he was a percentage point ahead of Anies.
Yeah.
Poppy, you're on the ground.
I just want to respond to Kevin's remark earlier.
Yeah, sure, go ahead. Yeah.
If we want to see the result from Ganjar's votes and also PDIP votes, it's equivalent. So you can see that even though his failure in Central Java, as you say, but then the numbers are also similar to what the PDIP got. So it means that Ganjar is unable to expand his popularity outside the PDIP votes, because as you can see, the PDIP got like 16-something%, which is equal to what Ganjar got also 16-something%, you know. So in that case, I think when we're talking about Ganjar, I think, yeah, again, Jokowi effect is really important. And then it's his inability to expand his popularity outside the PDIP anyway. So yeah, anyway, done, yeah.
But Poppy, I've heard criticisms of Ganjar that he, you know, he presents very well, but he wasn't terribly good at articulating an alternative policy agenda. And, you know, bear in mind, only a year ago, he was seen as the great, you know, the most likely winner. He was, you know, the golden boy. Where did things go wrong for Ganjar? And I mean, there was that incident about the Israeli football under-18 Israeli football competition and whatever, which clearly had a bit of a dent. Was he seen too much of a vassal of Megawati, not enough of his own person? How do you analyze Ganjar's sudden, you know, quite dramatic fall over the course of that 12 months?
Well, it wasn't, as I mentioned earlier. So his support is solid from PDIP only. So he was sort of like, again, unable to get outside his comfort zone, if I may say. But based on as you mentioned earlier regarding his, during his campaign, because my background is IR, yeah, I like Ganjar's sort of like, you know, visions regarding the Indonesia's foreign policy. For me, as compared to, surprisingly, to be honest, as compared to the other two candidates, Ganjar has a very significant views regarding Indonesia's foreign policy, unlike Prabowo and also Anies even. So initially, I thought that Ganjar wouldn't have any sort of like, you know, vision regarding Indonesian foreign policy. However, it turns out to be he was the one who had a very clear idea regarding Indonesian foreign policy. Unfortunately, then, I don't know, somewhere else, he's kind of, you know, unable again, you know, to gain respect and then also to gain the support from other issues, in my opinion.
Do you think this marks the exit of Megawati as a powerful behind-the-scenes figure in Indonesian politics?
Yeah, I cannot deny that, to be honest.
You cannot.
I cannot deny that. Yes, I think
you think her days are over? Yeah.
Unfortunately.
I want to move on to some of the sort of policy issues, but before I do, something that has been on my mind is that, you know, in a way, Prabowo seems to be suffer from the kind of Trump phenomenon that even if he does garner support to win, he is intrinsically seen as illegitimate by sections of society, political activists, academics, etc. You know, the mindset being the election is only valid if our candidate wins. Given the resounding level of his support, does that attitude, you think, dissipate over time, this idea that he's an intrinsically illegitimate candidate?
Oh,
and we'll come to Vetti on that too, yeah.
Please, Kevin. Yeah.
Oh, I was going it's a sort of, but it will depend a little bit about how he conducts himself after the 20th of October. So at this stage, yes, it's a comfortable win, and there's no way you can demonstrate that you didn't get a majority of the vote. So unlike both times with Donald Trump, really, because he didn't actually defeat the Democrat candidates in votes, he won a legitimate victory in 2016 through the Electoral College. But he clearly didn't win subsequently. This was an order of victory beyond that kind of questioning. But I think it will be more about how the incoming president conducts himself as to whether those kind of noises start to repercolate and what they actually mean in terms of influence. So I think people will take a holding pattern to see that. But in terms of the election itself, done and dusted, I think that would be my view, except to understand a little bit about what possibilities there are to re-strengthen the kind of the guardrails in terms of what's appropriate and not in terms of supporting a candidate.
Anybody else want to buy in on that?
Yeah, so agree with Kevin. I think that, you know, the KPU has validated the result. It'll be, there's still a lot of disgruntlement in some sections, but, overall, he'll be considered a legitimate president. He's won enough of the vote, certainly, and all that. But so here, I think, comes the more interesting phase, because we always, more or less, for quite a while, knew what the results would be, right? Poppy, not surprising, but still shocking, right? Not surprising. So the interesting bit now is really how Jokowi will deal with Prabowo. I think that is going to be the key to Indonesian democracy and politics in the near future.
That brings me to my next question,
Oh,
Betty. I'd like to embark on a little bit of an analysis of the Prabowo presidency. So we've sort of covered the election briefly as best we could, but there are going to be a diverse range of issues on the domestic front that Prabowo has to confront, and I would have thought key amongst them will be the Prabowo-Jokowi dynamic around the selection of the ministry, but also what priority policies Prabowo should follow. I think it's one reasonable presumption, working assumption, that Prabowo didn't spend all these years aspiring to be president to simply to see his tenure as a coda to the wiser and more visionary Jokowi. So how does he differentiate himself from Jokowi? How does he make himself his own man in office? And Vedi, you might want to pick that up.
Okay, well, I mean, by temperament, first of all, he's extremely different from Jokowi, so we'll see a lot of difference there. I mean, he's not been above table banging and so on in the past. I think that, the sort of more quiet authoritarianism that Jokowi came to develop an inclination for will become more loud under Prabowo. But as I was saying earlier, I think, so Jokowi essentially has decided that it is better to align himself with Prabowo than with Megawati, right? He can't be Megawati's, party official, right? But he also, will not be able to make Prabowo into his puppet, right? So I think that over the next, couple of years and beyond, this February to October interregnum, where they're going to fight about cabinet positions and so on, that will be the main area of conflict in Indonesian politics. And we already see a sign of where this is heading towards by Jokowi's maneuvers right now to acquire for himself the position of the head of the supervisory board of Golkar, the position that Suharto, by the way, occupied, right? So that will give him a base. I mean, his problem has always been that he didn't have his own party, right? And Kaesang's takeover of the PSI only had a small result. But having Golkar, to be behind him will give him some leverage in that competition within the Prabowo alliance, I think. And it'll decide, how the spoils of power are going to be divided between their supporters.
And Poppy, what's your take on that? Do you want to buy into that?
Well, I think, again, in my opinion, if what we see here is actually the dynamics between the Prabowo's relations and Jokowi. I agree with Pak Fedi, the decision, everything probably started from Jokowi's decision not to take side with Megawati that made the whole things different now with the current result. So that's why I think the future of Indonesia's democracy, unfortunately, is again depending on the relations of these among these elites, and then when they're, in my opinion, also Prabowo's, how then the legitimacy of the Prabowo due to this controversial sort of result of the pemilu or election is also how then Prabowo could present himself like different Prabowo from his past. That's also important. as at least for certain groups in the society. As we can see, like 69 millions people voted for him. That's something. But then there are still some strong voices regarding his past that needs to be handled wisely. He had to prove that he's different Prabowo from his past. That is also important in order to get the legitimacy from the civil society, and especially for the strong voices regarding his alleged with the human rights issues before.
If you're having a guess about this, how long do you think the Prabowo-Jokowi alliance will last?
I don't think for too long, actually.
I gather there are already, tensions. Jokowi has asked for specific things that Prabowo has refused. So already it seems some of the tensions are showing. So, but your estimate, Vedi, you think just a short time?
I think a fairly short time, and frankly, in his heart of hearts, I think that Jokowi is probably hoping for Prabowo to keel over so that Gibran can be president.
Well, that's an interesting scenario in itself that we could explore. Prabowo has set some fairly ambitious targets, particularly in relation to economic growth. I think the number was 8%, wasn't it? He has to spend a tremendous amount on improving human capital, education, attracting more foreign investment to get there. This is your field, Poppy. How do you rate his chances of doing that, given that Jokowi never made it to that level of economic growth? He promised 7%, but mostly tracked at about 5%. It seems a very ambitious number to be aiming for.
Well, based on at least his campaign, it seems like there are several aspects that Prabowo is using during his campaign to continue whatever the Jokowi's been doing so far. So including, say, for example, Jokowi's objectives and Jokowi's sort of like, goals in order to push the infrastructure projects, the economic development, things like that. At least based on the Prabowo's campaign is going to continue. So that's why his tagline is continuity. As we remember from the debate and also from the campaign, like the Anies is wanting to show that he's different from Jokowi, but Prabowo keeps saying that he's going to continue whatever the current government is doing, including probably, in my opinion, is how then the Prabowo is going to continue Jokowi's pragmatism in regard to Indonesia's foreign policy in order to support the economic and also national, objectives. How then the Indonesia's foreign policy is going to be more on the, inward-looking, supporting the national objectives and things like that.
In terms of the big signature projects that Jokowi has pursued, and none more important than the new capital, Nusantara. I know that Prabowo has committed to that, but once he gets in there and looks at the numbers and sees them continuing to mount, do you think there is a prospect that he could wind that back?
No, but they could slow it down. I mean, I think there's been a kind of a sort of a foie gras pushing of the pace over the last couple of years, ostensibly to get what I would have thought beyond a threshold, which would make closing it down simply too expensive to consider. But if it is still going ahead, I mean, firstly, I think they've finally stopped running around the world with a begging bowl asking foreigners to build it for them. And I think that's a much more dignified outcome. I happen to think that building your national capital is a personal view, but I think building your national capital is a sacred duty of the nation, not the rest of the world. And secondly, where's the profit in it anyway? So that I think is a good thing. And if it's going to continue, it doesn't have to be finished tomorrow. I mean, it took 17 years to get a provisional parliament in Australia and an extra 50 before we got the final one. So it's not like these things have to be done instantly, but better to do a great job. And there are prospects for being able to do that if they're careful. So I'm relaxed on that. But what I see this time is not just an elegant transfer, which is what we saw from Habibie to Wahid and from Yudhoyono to Jokowi, but actually a smooth one, because some of his of the incoming president's agenda are being factored into the forthcoming budget. For example, the lunch and money, the lunch and milk program, which it isn't normally done, because normally the president gets inaugurated late October, scrambles around to find any way with the budget almost finalized to get any of their agenda in the first year. So really the president's kind of unable to do a great deal until at least the second year of their presidency, when they've really had command of the budget. So actually including some of these things earlier is a good thing. And on the law on Jakarta, so in addition to the electing or not electing the governor, Prabowo's had an idea for several of his campaigns of a regional kind of super oversight body in the office run by the vice president. So it's called, in this law, it's called Regional Agglomeration Council, but it's something that he's been advocating for at least in the two campaigns that he ran, 2014 and 19. So that itself has already been included as an important initiative in the new Jakarta law. So this to me suggests not just an elegant transition, but a smooth succession. And also bear in mind, he's wanted to be president since before Jokowi was born. He's certainly not going to sacrifice his own presidency for anybody else's. So I think what we'll see is gradually this as we head towards October.
Yeah, I think yeah, Kevin is right. At best, it will be delayed. But given your question about economic growth and so on, I mean, where will the economic growth come from? Is I think still a question. I mean, is it from extractive industries, which has been the case, and also from consumer demand rather than from investment? And the other issue really is, Jokowi has situated himself in a particular way in terms of an alliance of the state companies with Chinese capital, like mainland Chinese capital. Is that something that Prabowo will be able to maintain? I think it is a question mark, particularly because of his own history, actually, of being somewhat anti-Chinese, and that his father, Sumitro Djahadikusumo, was famously very testy towards Lim Swee Leong and the other conglomerates. So that'd be an interesting thing to look at, actually, how Prabowo will handle domestic Chinese capital, as well as the mainland Chinese businesses that have become so integrated with many of the operations of the state companies in infrastructure, mining, etc.
I'd also throw in that I have a feeling he would like to recalibrate a little the position of Indonesia, but still non-aligned, obviously, but a little bit more towards the West and not so dependent upon the People's Republic of China. So I would actually look to him to be a little more engaging, or at least trying to engage. So it'll be interesting to see how.
He's certainly doing that with military equipment. I mean, he's got a much greater interest in US and European military equipment. No doubt he'll want to spend more on defense, given his background.
And the price of that is for the West to get his human rights records.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Now, one of the areas that, if he does exhibit autocratic tendencies, one of the areas for him to look at would be constitutional reform. And that's something that you and I discussed the other day, Kevin, but he's too old to want a third term. So fortunately, that old hairy chestnut, I imagine, is off the table. He does have a son, Didit, a fashion designer, who I don't think he's intent on building a dynasty, because I don't think there's much interest there in politics. But there probably is some concern, there's some risk of Prabowo winding back democracy further. Do you think there could be a risk of another bout of constitutional reform that further whittles away at the quality of democracy?
Well, I think if he raises the issue, I think that's unfortunate. There will unfortunately be people who a priori think he's heading in that direction. Whereas actually, I think there are really important things that could be done, which would actually improve both development prospects, but also prospects for democracy in the country. So I think there is a need for the country to have a serious internal dialogue about just what the so-called original 45 Constitution was. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but it's been applied in two very different ways. So the first time they applied it with what was a normal parliamentary system. You had a prime minister accountable to a parliament, presidency safe, you could change the prime minister, life moves on, no drama. And then after 59, when Sukarno brought it back, he decided to make himself prime minister at the same time. So you had the man do it, you had the head of state and head of government as the same person in a system where he couldn't sack himself or be asked to be. It was very odd system, and then that transformed into the standard Latin American presidential system we have now. So a discussion on that, but everyone thought it was always presidential when it wasn't. It was radical parliamentary. So discussion needs to happen, open up the minds on options and take away the sort of the toxic waste response and Pavlovian response that people have before you move forward on that. So I think that there are legitimate points of discussion there. But I think we need to be careful not to automatically assume he's trying to make himself a dictator because he wants to talk about constitutional reform. I think there are very legitimate constitutional improvements which would be taken personally if you split the job. But that's not what everyone just sort of, because Prabowo is saying it must be because he wants to be a dictator. But I think there needs to be a bigger debate than that.
Yeah, I think it can, this idea of how sacred the Constitution is and all of that, it can get a bit silly. But the reason that there is that what you call the Pavlovian reaction is because I think Prabowo is on record as having said, one, direct elections really should be scrapped in Indonesia, and two, that democracy isn't really suitable for Indonesia. He is on the record for saying that. So, insofar as that's Pavlovian, it does have a basis in things that Prabowo has said in the very recent past. And
although arguably that is the best thing about Indonesian democracy, if you go back to that 1999 election, and I've sort of been there for pretty much all those elections since, the best part is the way the people vote. I think the people seem to have a more sophisticated approach to democracy than the elites. Look, we've only got a couple of minutes left, and it doesn't seem we've got sort of questions coming in. And I did want to cover briefly some of the international relations issues. Given that time is short, we'll try to get through these very, very quickly. I think, the elephant in the room always is managing relations with China. How does Prabowo balance China's ambitions in the region, the South China Sea, other issues where Indonesian and Chinese interests overlap, and the need to engage with China to hit his 8% growth target? And I might switch that over to you if I could, Poppy.
Well, I would like to respond to your questions with the Prabowo's sort of like, introduce or commitments that he introduced. He's going to have the good neighbor policy as his basis or his principle for the Indonesia's foreign policy. That's one thing. Even though we need to see what he meant actually by saying that. The second aspect is what I'm sort of like my concern is Prabowo seems still, caught up with the Cold War mentality, in my opinion, at least based on what we see during the debate and during his campaign, saying that all the international relations can be seen as the threat. External power is a threat. So that's what he said. So that's why we need to be careful in those two things, despite he was saying that Indonesia's foreign policy should be based on the, neighbor good policy. But at the same time, he also perceived the international relations as still a threat for Indonesia. So in a way, I think, despite that he's going to continue some of the Jokowi's pragmatism regarding international relations, however, at the same time, we also would see probably, in my opinion, different kind of Indonesia's foreign policy if Prabowo still keeps, perceiving the idea about the external threat as part of this consideration in designing the Indonesia's foreign policy. So that's why I think he would see China, the US, even probably Australia as a threat if he meant it when he said that the international relations is full of threat. So that's why I think one of the aspects that we need to see is how he's going to choose his foreign minister for the next for his cabinet. someone that probably could also consider or probably could give him advice that the idea about international relations, as he keep repeating saying that, is already old-fashioned. So someone who can, reason him, that's not the way that we see the world at this moment. I guess that's the beginning of the, how we can see the Indonesia's foreign policy under Prabowo.
A missing link,
Similar to Suharto, isn't it?
but a missing link here that keeps getting referred to is the decline of Indonesian leadership within ASEAN. And, given that Prabowo is arguably the most experienced and sophisticated president when it comes to international relations that Indonesia has had, certainly, more experience abroad, I would have thought, than any previous president, even though both Sukarno and Suharto were quite high profile. Can we see a little bit more imagination from Prabowo and perhaps a willingness to take on leadership of ASEAN?
Well, his sort of like exposure to international relations is also important. However, his mindset and his perception regarding the international relations is also another aspect, Don. When earlier I mentioned that, surprisingly for me, the platform regarding the Indonesia's foreign policy, I could see clearly from Ganjar, which is, I found it very surprising. Despite that, he has probably lack of experience in terms of the international relations. However, again, as I mentioned to you previously, when we saw that he's giving the speech at the CSIS, it seems to me that he's much comfortable speaking in English than in speaking in Bahasa Indonesia. That's another thing that probably my concern. Probably he would be much more comfortable in attending international forum. However, again, if his mindset regarding international relations cannot be challenged by his, his future foreign ministers, probably it will be problematic for Indonesia as well.
Okay, so look, I've got one question to wrap up on, and I'll go around all three of you. Prabowo has said on more than one occasion, and most recently just in the lead up to the election campaign, that Indonesia does not forget old friends. And he referred to the support Australia offered Indonesia during the struggle for independence in the 1940s. And of course, this year we have the 70th anniversary of official Australian diplomatic relations with Indonesia. We've had good relations for the most part under SPY and Jokowi, notwithstanding some ruptures from time to time. And I did note that you said earlier, Poppy, that Australia might be perceived as a threat. How do you think Prabowo will manage the relationship with Australia? I mean, this notion that we don't forget our friends, he does seem to be reaching out to Australia.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit sort of like we need to be careful in seeing how Prabowo will perceive Indonesia's foreign policy, again, because it's kind of mix of mindset in his mind. I think for me, even though he sees that the international relations and external fact is very important for Prabowo, I don't think he would jeopardize the relations that we have built with Australia. However, for me, it is also important for, say, for example, people to be more sort of like critical in regard to his past, as long as he can show that now he has a very different views regarding, human rights, democratization, and everything. Probably people will be much more acceptable to him. But still, the past or the history is still overshadow whatever he's going to do in the future. Regarding to Indonesia and Australia relations, this is my expectation. This is not the prediction. This is my expectation that it's not going to ruin anything related to that, especially because after years of negotiation, we are able to have these, bilateral trade agreements. And then considering that we are close in terms of the geographical proximity, the trade relations between Indonesia and Australia is still, below. And then Indonesia is still not the biggest trading partners for Australia, and vice versa. So I don't think, any sort of like relations that we have can jeopardize that. So with that bilateral trade agreement, I hope that can be the modality for the Prabowo and his cabinet to keep, enhancing the current relations.
Okay, and I want to give a final word to Kevin and Vetty, and Kevin, I'll preface this by getting your assessment of how friendly you think a Prabowo-led Indonesia will be to foreign investment. Do you think that it'll give foreign investors pause, or do you think they might appreciate some greater decisiveness?
Well, this decisiveness can sometimes mean you've then got to backtrack because you didn't consult anybody or work out what the side effects of a policy you thought was a good idea. And suddenly you've got to backtrack. So it's not necessarily decisiveness is the best way to make economic policy. But I think on the bilateral relationship, actually, I could see it as a positive thing. I think his instincts, certainly as a military man, is to be a little bit more vigorous in defending the territorial sovereignty, particularly of the country's waters. With regards to Australia, he's actually developed a good relation on both sides of politics in Australia since he became a minister. And he might also see Australia as a useful counterbalance of sorts with the problems that he will definitely be facing with non-tariff barriers on exports and trade with Europe. So he would see the promoting of a solid partnership with Australia as something that could be useful in a broader element there. In terms of investment, again, would like to see a broader portfolio or broader source of nations investing in the country rather than being overly dependent on one. I think that's a standard Indonesian view. They don't want to be dependent on anybody. So a perception that they're overly dependent on any particular market would always, I think, lead to a sort of a response to say, okay, can we balance that out? So we're through that process, better guaranteeing our own sovereign options. And so in that regard, I would have thought that Australia could be quite helpful and very much fits in with the Southeast Asian strategy the Australian government launched middle of last year, particularly in terms of getting more capital investment, notably into Indonesia. So I think there's potential interesting partnerships there that could evolve.
And Vetty, you're based in Melbourne. You get the final word.
Okay, well, I think that Prabowo is an interesting individual from the point of view that there is this inherent contradiction within him as someone who's actually got a very cosmopolitan background and comes from a very cosmopolitan family, and yet is also an ultra-nationalist. So it's this contradiction that will, sort of at the personal level, right, play out, I think, and color the way that he deals with the international stage. On the one hand, he's far more comfortable than Jokowi in the international stage. I think that he'll try to be on the international stage as much as is possible, as long as there are no crowds going around attacking his human rights record, right? And with regards to Australia, I think that he wouldn't actually provide any kind of discontinuity from the Jokowi period, that he would be interested in maintaining good relations with Australia for all the reasons mentioned earlier. But if anything were to go wrong, let's say like the phone hacking scandal of the SBY period, you're going to have a different kind of reaction from Prabowo than you did from SBY.
Okay, well, look, I think we're out of time. Belatedly, a couple of questions did come into our chat function here, and I don't want to stretch the time, but if the questioners want to drop us an email, I'll do my best to provide answers to the questions that have come in. But I think we have to wrap it up there in the interest of timeliness. So can I say thank you to all of you? Very, very interesting conversation. So thank you, Poppy, Vetty, Kevin. Great to have you here. And I'll just turn back over to Leah to say some final remarks.
Thank you, Don, and thank you everyone for tuning in this evening. A recording of today's webinar will be available on the AsiaLink YouTube channel. You can also keep up with us over on AsiaLink Insights, where we provide commentary on all kinds of current affairs. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Everyone.